Hello, you're listening to 139th episode of Web-standarts podcast. I'm your host, Vadim Makeev. Today's episode is quite special, as you might have noticed. It's in English. Today we'll take 4 interviews with CSS-Minsk-JS conference speakers. Bram Stein, Lauke, Hui Jing Chen, and Migas. The conference took place on September 21st to 22nd in Minsk, Belarus. Let's start with Bram Stein. Before planning this interview for this podcast, I thought I would bring my copy of Web Font Handbook with me, but then I realized that it's digital one.
Yes.
So it's really hard to, maybe I should have printed it for you to sign. But yeah, have you ever published any other books, or did your first one?
I had it's called a chapter in Smashing Magazine, or Smashing Book 5, I think it was. 5,
the previous one.
Yeah.
On web typography and
on web fonts as well. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Before meeting you in person, before seeing you at the conferences, I always thought, for some reason, and before meeting Zach last year, I always thought that you work together. Maybe because I follow you on Twitter and you're always discussing something related to web fonts. I thought, yeah, like Zach and Bram from the Filament Group. Yeah, Adobe. Wait a second. And what's your responsibilities at Adobe? What you're doing there?
So I'm the head of web fonts there, which means I head up the web font service, product management things.
Like the typekit related something?
Oh yeah, I mean the whole thing is typekit.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, I do product management. I do lead engineer stuff. I'm all over the place, which I like. So
okay. And what is happening with typekit these days?
We're very busy with something I can't talk about yet.
All right. Some big announcement.
Big announcements.
This year?
This year.
Next month. So November?
October, yeah. Oh, it's September right now, yeah.
Okay. So I guess you're trying to compete with Google Fonts?
That depends on who you ask. I mean, Google Fonts, they have a lot of open source typefaces. And we have a lot of commercial typefaces.
Yeah, it's a bit different.
It's a different kind of audience and different kind of target.
Mm-hmm.
We do want to get more web font users. Okay,
but I think there's one thing you can do to make web font as a service thing much better than Google does, to include font display options.
Yeah, I mean, I can probably talk a little bit about that, but yeah, it's on my list of things to do.
Yeah, because I'm still waiting for Google to include it in Google Fonts, or like as an optional parameter. Do you have an idea, or like you can wild guess why they wouldn't do that?
I think they're mostly waiting for browser support to catch up, but I haven't talked to them in a while. So.
But this is a kind of a progressive enhancement?
It is, yeah. So maybe it's a user interface thing. I don't know.
Maybe it's just a priority or in a different...
Yeah, I know they're working on something called... I'm part of the W3C fonts working group, and Google is also part of that. And we're all working on basically doing dynamic augmentation, where you take a base font, and then the browser goes out and requests like a binary patch and then updates the font in place.
That's cool.
So you can start with a very basic subset, and then the browser can go out and get whatever glyphs you need to display the page properly.
That would be useful.
It would be very useful, especially for like CJK languages, where usually fonts are like several megabytes.
Tens of thousand glyphs.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I'm going to speak with Hui Jing later today, and I'm going to ask her, how is it possible to use a web font with 10,000 glyphs? Like, is it even possible? Or?
It is possible. We actually have a product, a typekit for that. It's called CJK font serving. And it basically works exactly the same thing that we're trying to standardize now. So it's a piece of JavaScript. You put it on your website. It looks at all the content and then requests whatever is needed to display that content.
You probably don't have 10,000 characters on your page, like different ones.
Right. It's usually a subset of the whole font that you need.
Okay. Going back to the topic you presented yesterday on CSS-Minsk-JS, variable fonts. I don't want to sound grumpy. I'm not going to criticize your talk. Don't worry. But I'm a bit tired of animated demos with variable fonts. Like, I'm looking forward to see good examples of usage. Like good, like you're taking the web font with like dozens of widths and characteristics, and you use it in a beautiful manner, like thin titles, like some other widths for text and difference. Because I used to learn typography in high school. I'm a big typography lover. So I don't know. There's so much more to do with this, but it's not happening. Maybe what's the problem? What is happening right now?
So it's a fairly new technology. It's, I think, 2 years now that it was announced, and it's just going to take a while before like all commercial typefaces are variable fonts. And right now, what we're seeing is a lot of experimentation, which is great.
Well, we're trying to.
And experimentation is usually flashy because that's the fun part.
We're pushing boundaries and trying to guess what to.
But there are already some examples of like practical applications, and I talked a little bit about that as well yesterday. Like the justification stuff. That's very useful.
That was an interesting demo.
Performance optimizations. It's a little bit hard to tell how well that's going to go because we don't have all the typefaces that you would normally use available as variable fonts, but it's coming.
And one problem that concerns me about variable fonts is performance. I haven't tested yet. I just came up with this idea yesterday during your talk. When you have a font like typical OTF or like WOF or something, it's just basically number of vector shapes and some rules applied to them. But when you have to synthesize font on the fly based on different rules, well, you have some vector shapes, but you have a lot of rules, and you have to synthesize it in runtime. How bad it is for performance?
It's a good question. So usually when you use a web font right now, you also download the font, and then the browser will send it to the operating system, which will parse the font file, and then render the type. So that step is very similar. And the additional interpolation doesn't add too much on top of that. But what's expensive is the flashy animations, where you basically have to re-render and throw away all the work you did before.
Right. So the problem is applying web font, not rendering it on a screen.
It's basically like redoing the same rendering over and over again when you have animations.
Right.
So if you use variable fonts in a static manner, it's probably pretty as performant as a normal regular font.
But rendering of glyph itself is offloaded to the system level, so it's not hurting browser performance. Is
Correct.
Right?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, the browser still needs to wait for it to become available, so it is maybe adding a little bit, but the interpolation step is pretty straightforward. It's
so milliseconds, and it's
yeah.
But as far as I understand, most of the browsers, maybe all of them, are using system implementations, but they're not shipping their ones, their own.
That depends. So Chrome is using FreeType to render. So they're embedding FreeType in Chrome, which is why they support variable fonts on all platforms right now.
But Firefox have decided to go with macOS implementations.
I think so. I haven't really followed up on what Firefox is doing.
Yeah, but I heard something about it.
Right.
Yeah.
So Safari is doing the same thing, which is why you only get variable font support on specific versions of macOS.
Like two last versions.
Yeah.
Or I wonder if the quality of the rendering or some specific features would be different between system implementations and third-party implementations. That might be a case.
So, for example, in the case of Chrome, like most regular font files are sent to the operating system, and variable fonts are sent to FreeType. So you could get a slight difference in rendering because FreeType might implement something slightly differently than the operating system. But I mean, it's going to be very minimal, I think.
Yeah, we still have to test it and see how it works.
Yeah.
Do you know any good like famous foundries that are making fonts that are working on some variable fonts right now? Are they creating new ones or recreating old ones in this new manner?
Yeah, I mean, as far as I know, that most of the major foundries are working on or at least experimenting with variable fonts. Like recently, Delta Mark released Ven, which is like a...
Yeah.
I know that some of them are also converting their old fonts to variable fonts because the way type design works is like, it's basically, when you design, it's a variable font. You kind of start with something and you extrapolate it and then you generate static font files from that. So they already have basically the data necessary to make variable fonts.
I think I heard a couple of years ago even some presentation from FontLab that they are supporting variable fonts already. So it's there.
Yep.
So basically tools are ready, operating systems and browsers are almost ready. So I guess it's just a question of time.
It's a question of time. And I think the big question for foundries is how are you going to price a variable font? Because usually when you buy a font, you buy a specific style, like a bold or a normal, and you pay like a certain amount for that. And with a variable font, you get basically the entire family. So how do you price it the same way as like the entire family, which is usually very expensive?
Yeah, they went through the similar process while this era of web fonts became reality, and they were trying to sell fonts like they would sell for designers first, and then they realized that it's not going to work. So they have lower prices for web fonts and some different tricky ways of selling them.
Right. Yeah. I haven't really seen many foundries figure that out yet, so it's going to be interesting. Most of them just release their variable font as like a trial version or like an experiment.
Well, it's still early stage. I guess.
Yeah, it is.
But on web, we used to have everything like tomorrow. I guess in fonts industry, it's a bit different.
Yeah, that's correct. But I think like at least my feeling is that variable fonts are really designed for the web. So it's going to be interesting to see how that develops. But usually like operating systems and applications lag a little bit behind because there's release cycles and other priorities as well. So.
Yeah, of course. You mentioned that you're taking part in CSS and standards around web fonts. Do you have some CSS properties that are stuck for years in drafts that you would like to be shipped tomorrow? Something like you.
No, I mean
on your wish list.
I have a very long wish list. I'm very focused on getting all the. Actually, I don't have any new properties, but I would like the existing properties to be implemented correctly.
All right.
And that's kind of the battle I've been fighting for the last couple of years. I think we've made pretty good progress there. Like I think we recently got like font stretch. It's like implemented across all modern browsers. So that's really nice. I would really like to see better justification algorithms in browsers because if you want to be a platform where people can read properly, then you need a better algorithm there.
I mean, hyphenation saved us. That was the first step.
Hyphenation is still not really great, but it's getting slowly better.
It's not just something that you would implement and forget about it because you need to have dictionaries. You have to probably update them and
correct. Yeah.
And it's I guess it's also depends on system libraries. It's not something that browser usually ship with them.
Depends on the application.
Yeah.
It depends on the browser. Yeah, like Safari is very focused on pushing as much responsibility to the platform, while Chrome is more like a standalone.
Yeah, of course, because they want to be cross-platform.
Correct. Yeah.
Do you know anything about Cyrillic? I mean, any good Cyrillic fonts, or you have experience like working with?
No, sorry, no. No, I mean, I know the character set, and I know it's very similar to Latin alphabet, where you can just subset it in one font, and you don't need to do anything fancy there. But that's pretty much the extent of my knowledge about Cyrillic.
So when you're watching movies about Russian spies, you can see that it's Cyrillic, but that's it.
Yeah, I usually turn on the English subtitles at that point.
Okay, but funny question. When I see, for example, as you mentioned, Latin is quite similar to Cyrillic in many ways. We have influence from Latin, obviously, but we also have a big influence from Greek because it was actually based on Greek alphabet, just like Latin as well. So it's a long story. But when I see Latin, it's fine. When I see like Chinese or some Eastern European, I get freaked out. Like it's totally different.
Right.
Like Arabic and this kind of system. And the weirdest thing that's common on internet, probably Greek. So it also looks a bit weird. It's not like Latin. But what do you see? What do you feel when you see Cyrillic? I mean, how weird it is. Like shapes of letters, or I mean, is it scary? Is it beautiful? Is it?
Yeah, Yeah, and it's not scary at all. I'm really fascinated by the shapes of letters. So I love looking at them, especially in really big sizes. I think they're beautiful for some reason.
They're different. That's for sure. But sometimes I look at the signs. Sometimes they put on a storefront, so they put like Cyrillic version and a Latin version. And I look at Latin and I think it's much more beautiful. Yeah. I guess it depends on the font.
Right, it depends on the font. Yeah.
And also, small letters are in Latin. They are much more well suited for reading, and their shapes they're actually easier to read. Cyrillic small letters look like small caps in many cases. So we have some problems with that. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's just a matter of getting more Cyrillic fonts. It's one of our goals at Adobe right now to kind of expand our library into multilingual space.
And maybe any Russian-based or foundries with Russian roots, like Paratype. Do you know this foundry?
I know the foundry. I don't know any people at the foundry, but I know the name, yeah.
Okay, and there's also really, really interesting project started a couple of years ago called Type Today. By Ilya Ruderman and some other people. I would recommend you checking this out. They have beautiful site. They have beautiful modern fonts with a good Cyrillic support, and that's their aim to make an international project to create international fonts, but with very high quality Cyrillic.
Okay.
So Type Today. It's actually the domain type.today. Okay, this is probably it. If you have any questions for me, go ahead. But
no, that's fine. Thank you. Yeah,
thank you for being here and for coming from far away to Minsk. I hope to see you someday in St. Petersburg. Maybe
it will be nice.
Okay.
Thank you.
And now we're back with Patrick Lauke. We used to work together in Opera DevRel team for many years, and it's been a lot of fun. Don't you think so?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was, of course, fun to meet up again. It's been 5-6 years.
Yeah.
We haven't seen each other
Forever.
And no, I always like to go to new places, new conferences. I've not been to Belarus before or Minsk, and as ever, similar to conferences that I've attended in Moscow, I find the audience is very switched on, good questions, very interested. So overall, it's been a good mix of topics so far. I've seen most of the CSS, all of the CSS stuff yesterday. This morning I did my workshop. I'm looking forward to catching a few JavaScript ones this afternoon as well. So overall, really good.
Well, this time it was Area, but you used to be known as Mr. Touchy.
I still am in certain circles, but don't repeat that.
But you're known not just for your 5-hour-long talk on touch events and pointer events, but also about some standard work in this area. Do you still do something?
I'm still I'm the chair and co-editor of the Pointer Events Level 2 specification, which we're just about to finalize in the W3C sense. And we heard you're probably getting towards the announcement on Twitter this morning.
Big news.
Yeah, that
during your workshop.
During my I saw something late last night, early this morning.
All right.
But yeah, it's basically the only browser that up until now was refusing to even engage with the topic of pointer events was one from a certain Cupertino-based company. Apart from that, you had Chrome has had pointer events for ages. Obviously, IE 11 started with support, and Edge, obviously. Firefox, they're nearly there with their full implementation as well. And
is it still behind the flags? Or
I think it currently still is. I'd have to double check. I sometimes find it difficult to work out because obviously I've got my specific setup where it's always enabled, and I have to then explicitly go into about config and see.
I have a solution for that. I always
profiles.
No. I always use Nightly or technology preview browsers for enabling flags. In stable browsers, it's everything's by default. In Canary, in Firefox Nightly, in Safari Technology Preview, etc., it's enabled. So it helps.
See, that would make sense, but I'm not very logical or organized. But yeah, so the big news obviously was that after years of pretty much not just ignoring it, but semi-publicly saying that they were just not interested, that Apple are going to support pointer events. So it's in development at the moment. So hopefully now the topic will be of interest to developers, because quite often in the last few years that I've been touring my presentation and talking about pointer events, the big sticking point is always, well, this is great, but as long as Safari on iOS doesn't support it, why should I bother? I'd have
chicken
to
egg.
Exactly. So yeah, hopefully it will become again a reasonably good topic, and I can dust off my presentation, my 600 slides, and it will be good though. I mean, I still personally think, I know I'm biased, but I still think that the technology itself, pointer events, is really good, because it's just an umbrella way of defining events that work, for touch, for mouse, for stylus, and any other kind of mouse-like or touch screen-like interfaces. And it gives you the best of both worlds. Instead of having to do explicitly, I do handling for mouse and then I separately do touch. Mm-hmm. You can either do the same behavior just with one event listener, or if you really want to, you can use one event listener, but then inside the handling say, what if this event came from a touchscreen? Follow this code path, and if it was a stylus, do this other thing. So it gives you the best of both worlds. You can keep things really simple. If you just want to replicate, for touch, the same thing happens as for mouse, then you just save yourself lots of doubling up of code. But you can also be specific.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to have a single model for all kind of interactions.
Yeah.
And I was always wondering why Apple, with their variety of devices, with their Apple Pencils and Force Touch and whatever they have these days, they still use hacks. They still invent their own events with tons of prefixes, with some hacks for their touch events spec. So it probably makes sense for them to start doing this. And finally they're here.
Yeah, I mean the big argument was always that Apple weren't going to have devices where there's more than one input modality. You got your touchscreen devices, then you got your laptops. And, the world is quite, sharply divided between those two. But I
guess pencil and touch.
Yeah, pencil already then happened. There was for years, there was the talk of who would ever want a stylus. And then all of a sudden, ta-da, here's the Apple Pencil. How innovative.
Here's your stylus. Remember this, Steve Jobs?
That's it.
Yeah.
And then to support that, Apple extended touch events. So all of a sudden you still had touch events, but then inside the touch event, you could differentiate. Does it come from a finger? Or
so basically what's pointer events doing?
Exactly. So it was just another not invented here kind of thing. But, Apple is kind of, it's weird depending on where you look. They are really good players when it comes to standardization, but with other things they're not. And with touch, particularly anything relating to touch, there's been a lot of history of legal departments getting involved with certain things. And you remember from our time at Opera that the big P word of patents that was never to be mentioned. So there are, it's not just the evil engineers at Apple, but there were kind of legal complications. But I'm assuming that that's now being resolved.
But I always thought that W3 specs are P free.
And that's probably the problem. I mean, if you think back at the history, as I often do, think back at the history of touch events. I mean, it wasn't Apple that standardized touch events. Apple certainly invented touch events when iOS 2, in 1, you still had to rely on mouse events, but with iOS 2, they definitely invented touch events, completely on their own. Which is also why they were a little bit idiosyncratic compared to other events that we had before. But then they never submitted it for standardization. And then they were retrospectively standardized. And there was a little bit of legal backwards and forwards where there was a patent advisory group, PAG being called at W3C, to see should this specification be allowed? Because does it infringe on patents that Apple may hold? And in the end, it was found that it didn't. But yeah, so there's been kind of a colorful history already with touch events, and I'm guessing that kind of colored some of the later decisions. But all that's water under the bridge, and I'm hoping, I've already semi-officially said, to one of the Apple engineers, do you want to join the pointer events working group now at W3C? I mean, it would be nice, get some input, and we're hoping to work on pointer events level 3. We have a W3C meeting later next month, and we're hoping to kind of get agreement between Mozilla and Google that we want to carry on, and Microsoft, of course, that we want to carry on. And, it would be a nice time for Apple maybe to just even, at least acknowledge or, sit down at the table with us. So here's hoping.
Isn't pointer event spec perfect enough? Why would you need second or third spec? I mean, what's the difference? What's the new thing you're developing?
Already with pointer events level 1, which was before my time in terms of I was involved with the working group, but I wasn't leading it or anything. That was already quite good. That was that standardized pretty much what Microsoft did in IE. But there were lots of kind of edge cases and other concerns that weren't thought about. Things like, how does it interact with Shadow DOM? There's always the question of, how do events bubble in that situation? Right. Things like, the touch action CSS property. There were some values, but we found some different use cases where it would be nice to be able to define this as well. So it's more of a refinement. It's not, it's always backwards compatible, of course, but it just adds a few things. And pointer events level 2, which we're hoping now to push out.
So it's rather HTML 5.1 than HTML6.
Absolutely. It's evolution, not revolution. To coin a Bruce Lawson-y type phrase. So yeah, there's a few aspects now with being able to more clearly jump into low-level events through pointer events, because without going into too much detail, pointer events, the browser, the user agent does a lot of magic behind the scenes. If you move your finger or your stylus very quickly, the browser will generally average a little bit of that. So it doesn't send you a stream of thousands of events.
Yeah.
It'll send you a few hundred where it kind of finds the average, which is generally what the developer wants. But if you're really doing something at a very low level, like you want a drawing application where it really catches every single thing, you really want the uncorrupted, pure data stream effectively.
It reminds me GPS. Like you have different signals from different area, and you have to approximate the actual path before showing it.
That's it. So at the moment, the browsers will kind of clean up the data a little bit before you get it, but there are situations where you'd want it. So that is one of the aspects we'd want to kind of make either a separate method in the API, or some kind of attribute in the API to say, give me the raw data rather than the cleaned up data. So it's more little extra things like that to cover more specific use cases. And things like drawing applications are kind of the classic example of where you really want as close to the raw kind of data as you can.
Of course. And since pointer events getting better every day, is there any future for touch events spec?
Yeah, probably not a need. Touch events behave slightly differently in certain situations. So one of the key aspects where touch events by design are different is that, and I need to remember it right. Yeah, it still fires things like, say, touch move while the browser is scrolling as well. So while you're scrolling it, you can kind of follow touch movements, which is basically what's behind those, most of the pull to refresh kind of implementations. With pointer events, you can't. As soon as the browser takes any action, such as scrolling, you get a pointer cancel, and then the browser takes over. So, but that's more of a kind of implementation detail. I think the real reason for keeping touch events around will be backwards compatibility. As long as we still have devices in circulation that don't update to the very latest and greatest, And at this stage, it's mostly older iOS kind of implementations.
So it's basically like XHR versus Fetch.
Yeah.
They're different, but it makes sense to not just disable XHR.
That's it. I mean, you wouldn't, if you started afresh now, depending on what you're doing, it might make sense to just go straight for pointer events and polyfill.
Yeah.
Although there's always the argument that the device that doesn't support it is the less performant one, and you're basically penalizing it further. So, that's philosophical. You can polyfill it, or you can kind of reverse polyfill it if you want.
Yeah, you can polyfill the shit out of i6.
That's it.
But would it work, actually?
Yeah,
No, I don't think so.
I don't know.
Okay, we were supposed to talk about area and accessibility, but some things went wrong. Back to your work at Paciello Group. What your company is doing these days, and what's your role there?
Yeah, sure. So my job is at the Paciello Group. It's an accessibility consultancy, and I'm one of the senior accessibility engineers there. Our team has recently grown quite a bit through various mergers and acquisitions and different things. But essentially, there's probably like ballpark it about 30 or 40 engineers throughout the world. Some senior, some just regular. I hate that distinction anyway. I don't know. I mean, I feel like I'm senior, but mostly because of the getting up in the morning is getting harder and harder for me. So day job really is. Essentially, we do a lot of auditing for customers, so for accessibility. So customers would come to us and say, we have a website, web application, or even native applications, or a device, so actual physical devices, and we need to be compliant in terms of accessibility for various reasons. Some clients come because they want to do the right thing. At the other end of the spectrum, you might get clients who are about to get sued or are getting sued, and they need to provide evidence of where their system is currently at and show that they're making an effort to remediate. And what we do most of the time is essentially accessibility audits. So we go through, say individual web pages or test a particular product, and we make a note of any failings that we find generally against WCAG, against Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 now, which are the latest. So we give them a nice big spreadsheet, a written report, and put things in their Jira if they so require, to basically tell them essentially, well, this is broken, and here's our kind of recommendation of how you could approach fixing this particular thing. So I'm in the lucky position that I don't have to actually fix other people's code.
Oh yeah, that's really good to just complain about someone else's code,
and I get paid to complain.
That's
the best. But no, we try to provide as much technical info as possible. So we to a certain extent we take their existing markup and we say, well, here's a recommendation of how it should look at the end. So we show them, like, if you add these ARIA attributes here, or if you add this extra JavaScript here, this will work better. So
some actionable plan.
Yeah, absolutely. But we're not the ones that basically have to actually do it. And because in general, we only look at the output, so HTML, CSS, JavaScript, we don't look at the technology that might sit behind it, like, I don't know, PHP, ASP, et cetera. So that's not our main concern. I mean, for some projects, we've now started diving into more things like, well, we're using Angular or React, and we have one or two people that, out of their interest, have started looking at how can you do things in Angular, make it output a certain thing, or to generate the DOM the way it should be. But in general, really, we're more at the we're looking at the end result rather than the markup. And for things like native, for instance, if it's an iOS application, we literally do like a functional audit. We go through, we load it on our devices, we test it with screen readers and for various other things like color contrast based on, the screenshots essentially. But we don't get the Xcode or, the Swift or anything like that. We don't look at that. unless asked to in general.
So you're acting rather like users, not developers,
That's
and
right.
this is a good thing because when you're a developer, you can easily overlook some parts of interactions.
That's it, and sometimes you don't even know because even speaking at the workshop this morning, I tried to kind of hammer the point across that it's not that you're doing it because you want to be evil or you don't want to do it the right way. But some of the stuff is really, unless you know how screen reader users interact with something, for instance,
It's tricky.
you wouldn't find it. You wouldn't even notice that things are there. I've seen it with a lot of the ARIA stuff in particular, kind of tying it back to my workshop. A lot of the ARIA stuff is most of the ARIA stuff is explicitly about telling screen readers what content is and how it behaves and what its state is. But that only works, it's only sent to screen readers. It doesn't affect the way things look on the page or the way you interact with them. So it's really easy for a developer to build something, think they've done it right, and not notice that they've actually done it wrong.
It reminds me of schema.org.
Yeah.
It's just small instructions.
That's
You're
it.
like or micro formats. You're just putting here and there, and it's much easier for screen readers to consume this interface.
Exactly. And with ARIA, you then update it dynamically because that's really what happens with dynamic websites. And it's about making sure that you keep state both in the ARIA and in whatever your application is doing behind the scenes.
I was about to ask stupid questions. Maybe
That's okay.
I'll try. Why don't we just automate everything and use Lighthouse?
So the testing,
Is it possible to automate, and what part of accessibility audit could be automated?
Now, the thing with accessibility in general is that it kind of lies on the crossroads between technical solutions and kind of human, non-technical solutions. There's certainly, particularly when we start looking at ARIA, there's certainly the aspect where you have to code things a certain way. Certain attributes need to be there. The value needs to be a valid value. But once you go beyond that, it's a bit like spell checking. You can spell check a document and it tells you that you've made no spelling errors, but it can't guarantee you that
It makes sense.
sentence makes sense. And it's exactly that.
Yeah.
ARIA, purely ARIA as a technology, is just a way for you as a developer to say, this is my intent. If you do it wrong, a tool cannot infer the intent, because if it could, then we wouldn't need ARIA, because then browsers would just do it. They would just say there's a div with a click handler. The developer must mean that that's a button, and I'll just say to the screen reader, oh, there's a button here. But because we can't infer that in all situations, because it might be for whatever other reasons that the developer's done this, it's not automatable in that sense. So there are aspects that can be automated, really trivial stuff like making sure the markup is valid. That's one of the old kind of success criteria from WCAG, which makes sense in most cases. But, start off with valid markup. Make sure that, you're using correct attribute names and you're not misspelling them. Like, Viewbox with a capital B. Vadim helped me debug some SVG the other day. But, things like that, that's stuff that can be automated. And to a certain extent, you can say, well, there are very specific patterns in ARIA that need to be followed. And this can be automated, like an item with role menu item must be the child of something with a role menu or role menu bar.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, the W3C validator, if you run, the new validator version, if you run a page with static ARIA, so, obviously not stuff that changes dynamically, but, if you have ARIA in your HTML markup, it will actually flag those kind of common errors, like, this role is not allowed at this point in the document.
That's
so
cool.
you can do some of the stuff. That's easily automatable. Once you get into other aspects, like, does this actually reflect the reality of what this control is doing? Or
I have a classical example. Like you can. I see a lot of alt attributes on images containing the path to a picture.
Yeah.
Like it's not empty.
Yeah,
then it's fine.
That's it.
But it's not.
The spell checker said it's okay.
Yeah.
and that's the thing, just that's WCAG success criterion 111. So the first one. And you can have like hour-long debates about what is the most appropriate alt attribute. And it's not because it's technically, technically you can test, is there something, is there not something?
Yeah.
Or is the attribute completely absent? That's fine. But does it actually reflect what the intent and the purpose of the image is? That's something that you need at this stage. You need a human to be able to evaluate that. Now, people are going to say, oh, machine learning, image detection. It's possible, but, if I put a picture of Hello Kitty in my slides, it might be because it's appropriate from a content point of view or just because I'm a weirdo. But, a tool cannot determine if it's appropriate. Or if I have an image and I know, you know the answer. If I have an image and there's an empty alt, which generally says this is irrelevant and, you shouldn't really mention that there is an image. Is that appropriate? That's usually appropriate for presentational images. Now, what is presentational? It's there to provide a mood, a feeling, just something visual. Are you kind of providing the same mood in other ways, like in your writing? There's so many kind of very vague things where you really need, a human to have a subjective view on some of the matters. And that's one of the dirty secrets of WCAG, of accessibility testing, is that there is always a tiny bit of an aspect of subjectivity, which is why sometimes you might get 2 or 3 auditors working on things, and we discuss things internally and kind of come to some kind of decision. But ultimately, and again, that's the dirty secret. Ultimately, it's still our interpretation to an extent. There's stuff that can be, yes or no, it's black and white, and other stuff that is a rainbow of gray.
Oh, yeah. Do you have some people in your company that with certain disabilities that help you test actual experience? Because we could only guess. If we use interfaces like regular people, we can only guess.
Yeah,
we can read spec and documentation and try to imagine how it feels, but it's not like fully accurate.
Yeah, no, we have some of our engineers and some of our consultants, use screen readers on a day-to-day basis for their own needs, and screen magnifiers, etc. We're also obviously, all of us to a slightly greater extent than normal developers, are familiar with
of course,
how these things work. But yeah, absolutely, that's a big part of this kind of accessibility work. A big problem is that you can't just go to any developer and say, well, here's NVDA, here's JAWS, here's VoiceOver, do it, because they just don't know, what the experience is like. I mean, one of the very early examples of that is, I remember back in an old job of mine at a university, where we had some well-meaning developers in the university that said, oh, well, we've now started testing things in screen readers, and we found that, everything is so long, the pages are so long, so we're going to make all our pages really short. And it was because they thought that screen reader users just loaded the page and then just sat back and had it all read out from start to finish. And then you show them, no, it's actually more of an interactive thing. Screen reader users have like a words per minute count that is like astronomical. So if you actually listen in on somebody with a screen reader that they're using it properly, you cannot understand it as a mere mortal. And then, they'll jump around, they'll, jump from focusable element to the next. They might bring up some different dialogues, navigate by headings. It's far more interactive. They almost never, sit back and just say, read all from start to finish. And, it was well-meaning from the developers at that time to say, we're going to make our pages really short. But it's like, it's good, but you don't understand how people actually use it.
It's not audio book, it's interactive interface, exactly. But interaction is different.
Yeah. But that's the danger. Like you give somebody who doesn't know, how it's used, the tool, and then they might draw their wrong conclusions. So yeah, it's tricky.
I'm really proud of myself that I like for the first 5 times I launched VoiceOver, I was terrified of speed of unknown, like alien interface.
Absolutely.
I'm still terrified, but I started. But I started to use it more often, and these days I can even record some videos and some sounds from VoiceOver reading some text and share it with developers and show how it actually works. I'm not a VoiceOver power user, yeah, but at least I know. At least I tried.
Yeah.
I think every developer should try this one.
Should face the fear.
Because the same applies to proxy browsers. Remember?
Oh yes, Opera Mini.
And it's just a different kind of interface, different kind of device or way of consuming information.
Mm-hmm.
Well, probably the last question for today. Why you are not allowed to speak at SmashingConf anymore?
Well, as you know, Vadim, I always have a lot to say when I'm presenting in particular, and it's always difficult to bind me to 45 minutes to 1 hour in my presentations, and I generally just ignore the time. Or I'll start off well-meaning, and then I start speeding up really towards the end. And well, one of the my first and currently last appearance at Smashing, I just overran by probably about 20 minutes. So I had to be physically dragged off stage by Vitaly. But apart from that, I think we kissed and made up, or at least we kissed. And you never know. You never know.
Okay, so you switched to workshops. I think it suits you better.
That's right. And yes, today was a 4-hour workshop, and surprisingly, I still managed to overrun by about 10 minutes. However, I've been assured by all the participants who were about to lynch me because I was just before lunch that no, it was valuable. It was good. One of the just to tie up with a previous question, one of the ideas I wanted to bring across in my talk was for the developers that came along to the workshop to at least get an initial feel for screen readers and even knowing, that they exist. I had high hopes that I would have enough time to also let them have a play on their own laptops and fire up VoiceOver. But I did in the end, well, apart from running out of time, I decided slightly against it because it is really a completely alien world. It's not something that you can just say to a developer, oh, you've never used a screen reader or even knew what a screen reader was until this morning. Here, let me fire up, VoiceOver or NVDA or Narrator or whatever, and let me completely mess up how your machine works now. And, you won't have any idea how to even disable it without me telling you. So I kind of opted against that. I'd need another 4 hours to kind of do that.
Would you be interested in a workshop like this, like a day-long workshop, maybe in St. Petersburg next year?
That would be good. I mean, so now I'm going from I can't keep 45 minutes. I can't do an hour. 4 hours is too short. I'm now at a day. Soon it's going to be like I don't know, like a 1 week retreat in the Alps or something. But no, absolutely. I think with a full day, but with the material that I had today, it would probably allow for a little bit of hands-on and maybe even people bringing stuff. It depends a bit on the experience level. I've done this same workshop with people at an accessibility conference, and you can you can take a lot of things for granted. You don't have to explain what a screen reader is, for instance.
Yeah.
And there it was a lot more focused on, you all know this, but here's the specifics. But assuming an audience of eager people that are willing to do to work on accessibility, but haven't had the chance, probably 6 to 8 hours sounds about right. Yeah.
I'll try to organize it then.
Perfect.
Thank you for being with us today.
No problem. My pleasure.
Sure. Thanks. And we're back with another guest. It's Hui Jing. I probably mispronounced your name, but I'm sorry.
It's correct.
It's complicated. I saw your articles maybe a couple of years ago or something like this on grid layout and Flexbox. That's where when I first saw your name and saw your articles. And then all of a sudden you applied for CSS-Conf last year. How did it happen? How did you decided to start speaking at conferences, and where did it came from? Or you just started just like most of us on local meetups and then decided to go to international conferences?
I started speaking at local meetups, and it was because a friend of mine, because I hadn't thought about speaking previously, but I did write an article that got published on A List Apart, and that friend of mine was like, you should talk about your article on in our local JavaScript meetup. And I was like, this article has nothing to do about JavaScript, but it's okay. And after that, she was like, hey, you're kind of good at this. You should try applying to international conferences. I'm like, nah. But I guess Peter CSS was actually the second conference that I left the country to go to. And
What was the first one?
WebConf Asia in Hong Kong. And I think I tried applying a bit before that, but usually just got rejected. I think it just so happened that the talk that I proposed for both, which was the East Asian typography one, I think maybe that was a topic that not many people talk about, and maybe conference organizers found it interesting. And I got invited for that talk quite a lot by now. And yeah, I realized that it's interesting to talk about something that is familiar to me, but not very familiar to my audience. And so that was
not repeating all things all over again, but something open some new territories for them.
Yeah, and I found that speaking at conferences was a very good way to meet a lot of people that I otherwise wouldn't have met. Like I met you in person first time in St. Petersburg, and now I'm meeting you again in Minsk.
I think we met in Kiev.
In Kiev, yeah.
In May.
Yeah, and if I hadn't started speaking, I would have never met any of you. And it's been very eye-opening and valuable for me to hear perspectives from like cultures that are so far away from me, because I'm based in Singapore.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think I'm very lucky, and I'm very thankful to you for inviting me to Peter CSS. I think that was the beginning of a lot of opportunities, that I met a lot of people that then who introduced me to other people, and then introduced me to other people, and like here I am.
We were happy to have you. Like it was a very, very good topic to show to Russian audience. I mean, I'm a big fan of web typography and exotic typography as well. I have a few books on Arabic typography. I learned different weird things. Normal person wouldn't even look at it. But yeah. But for your talk, you're presented at CSS-Minsk-JS. Could you please summarize it somehow, to not just in a general way, but as an action, as an advice for developers that usually are focusing on their local typography or local tasks or interests, and maybe international ones, but it's mostly English one. What would you suggest them to learn? What would you suggest them to do?
So there were a few action items I hope could come out from my talk. One of them was actually for people to create more content in their own mother tongue, which is not English, because there's so much of the web is in English, and I think we need to have a more diverse language set and cultures, like in the online world, because it doesn't represent real life at the moment. That was one point. Another point was specific to East Asian typography. I wanted to share a bit more about the difference between East Asian languages and more commonly seen Latin languages that are based on alphabets. So, and I think Chinese is I don't know if this will be a thing in future, but I can see that, Chinese as a language, it might be advantageous to sort of understand a bit. You don't really necessarily have to know Chinese per se, but odds are you may or may not have a sort of the idea to have a target audience, like a Chinese audience. Maybe it would be helpful to understand a bit more about like typesetting it. Like I think it's similar to when you hear a television show where they try to get a foreign language in. And if you don't understand the foreign language, oh yeah, they're just speaking this foreign language. But if you know, for example, they get someone to say a few sentences in Chinese, and if you don't understand Chinese, like, oh, fine, you're speaking Chinese. But if you do understand Chinese, like, oh, that is not how you pronounce the word. You get a bit distracted. And I think it's...
just like a Russian mafia in movies. Like, it's terrible.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people who speak multiple languages get this same feeling. I think it's very similar if for example, the font used is incorrect, or like some of the words are wrong. You can't immediately, we can detect like, hey, you didn't get a native speaker to check this. So that's another thing. And the last thing is that even if you do not design for East Asian languages, the CSS that I talked about can be used in ways for the art direction perspective, like to create layouts that are, different from what we have now, because sometimes it seems that layouts have gotten a bit boring. Because everybody's using these frameworks, using this, let's have a hero image and 3 columns.
Yeah, those famous landing pages.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, let's be exciting. Let's add another column so it's a hero image and 4 columns. And it's like, come on. So that were the 3 takeaways that I hope the audience would have gotten from my talk.
But you gave this talk on many occasions. But what was your favorite one at this point? The best video recording, best version of yourself presenting it. I don't know.
That's so hard. That's really hard to say because so the code part of the talk I generally kept the same, but a lot of things around it I've evolved it as I've come along. For example, I thought this one was okay-ish. I attempted some Belarusian, and
you actually went very very deep and localized it and quoted some authors about like Belarusian language and things like that. So it's a rare thing these days that talks that are used in many occasions are localized or changed for the local event.
Yeah. Good.
So it was a really great thing to see.
Oh, thanks. So I tried, and the audience didn't like boo me off the stage, so I assumed the pronunciation was still okay. But it was also because that this topic it may seem irrelevant because like Chinese it's not commonly used here. So I was thinking, how can I make this talk still be relevant to the audience? And that's because I'm very lucky that this talk got picked up by many different conference organizers in different countries. So I felt that I had to sort of localize some of it to make it more relevant to the audience.
Yeah, you're acting like an ambassador for Asian typography. Yeah, it's really 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 good. Speaking of relevance, just a few hours ago, I've been approached by a guy who shared his experience, and he said like, we're working on a Chinese market here in Belarus. We're developing our product. We're testing it in weird browsers like QQ 360 and UC and some others, where WebKit version is like 31. Where everything is broken and media players are weird and a lot of bugs with keyboards and like everything is super complicated. And they have this reality, though they are based here in Minsk, for example. So it's like relevance is, it might be, it becomes, we are becoming a much more international community. So it's not like we're care only about what's happening in our country. Not anymore. So I think it's a really great thing for you to act like an ambassador of your culture.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe one day I'll try to tell a story about Cyrillic typography, or what we're doing here, and what are differences, and how to correctly use what fonts are good or what fonts are bad, because there are so many badly localized fonts.
Yeah, and I would love to see like I'm doing something for Han characters for Chinese, East Asian. I would love to see this something similar for Arabic, something for Hebrew, something for like Cyrillic, like Russian language. And I think it's necessary to sort of broaden everybody's perspective. Like the web is not automatically English. The web is supposed to be, this way that we connect the world. And so I think the world needs to be represented more wholesomely in the online world.
But it's still good that we have international language. Yeah, because we wouldn't sit here and speak Russian and Chinese at the same time and understanding each other. So yeah, English is playing a very, very, very important role in the modern culture and technology.
That's true.
So,
that's true.
Well, maybe it's sad that it's not Esperanto. I don't know, but it's I think it's really good that we have this opportunity to speak some neutral language, I would say. Going back to your talk, you mentioned Asian fonts that they usually takes like tens of thousands of glyphs. And what's the typical approach when you want to have some custom font? Because I know some fonts could be installed on your operating system and they could take like megabytes. And this is totally fine because they're already installed. But if you want to include some font these days, like if it's like Latin plus Cyrillic, it would be like 100 kilobytes tops. But for Asian fonts, it takes much more. What do you do? What's the trick here?
So for now, body copy, we generally do a system font stack for the three major operating systems. But for things that don't change, for things like maybe your title or like section headings, then that's a limited number of glyphs. And those, it's possible to just subset those characters and then the font becomes much smaller. So you can still inject some personality from the font, but for long body copy, we'll still use the system fonts because honestly, with the Mac system fonts have always been relatively nice. Windows 10 Chinese fonts have become much better because it used to be the Windows Chinese fonts used to be like not very nice, but Windows 10 ships with a lot more choice and better designed, and it's much more aesthetically pleasing to use a system font stack. So basically, that's the approach. I know that there are some build tools that are quite similar to what Peter shared in his talk, his tool called Subfont.
Like Glyphhanger by Zach?
Something like that. I know of this tool called Font Spider. It's developed by a Chinese developer that scrapes the content of the site and subsets to that. So again, that is probably more appropriate for static sites, but if you have a site that relies on user input, you probably won't be able to use that approach.
Yeah, that's true.
So for now, it's still very tricky, but subsetting seems like a viable option that works it's like a trade-off. So you still can use more unique fonts and designs, but for the main body, we'll still go back to the system font.
But these days, even for Latin, there is a trend of using system fonts.
That is true. That is true.
I'm so glad we got there because web fonts, you don't need web font if you have very similar fonts already available on your system. Like, for example, Russian type foundry Paratype. I don't know how did they manage to get to macOS, but they have their PT Sans and PT Sans Serif fonts and PT Mono available on macOS for years already, and with very good Cyrillic in it. Yeah, there are really good fonts available already on your operating system. You just have to double check before trying to create, at least have a nice fallback, not just Verdana and Tahoma. Seriously.
Yeah, and I think the fact that we're able to create font stacks. I think there should be a more like the design of the font stacks themselves. Like if we've spent a bit more effort like picking the fonts for the font stack, I think we can provide a relatively nice experience for our users in terms of aesthetics when it comes to fonts. Sometimes I feel that fonts, usually people probably use like Google Fonts. It's like the font and then it immediately goes to like serif or sans serif without anything in between.
Yeah.
But I think if we put a bit more effort into crafting that font stack, I think that's quite a good intermediate solution to that issue.
I'm shocked to see that even specifying generic font family is not often the case, because I sometimes I see before web font is loaded, I see just Times New Roman, and when I go to CSS, I see like my custom font, and that's it, and this is so weird. So please, like serif, sans serif at least. Yeah, monospace. Yeah, something like this. Going back to Asia, how open and how active is Chinese or Eastern Asian front-end community? The top 3 conferences or top 3 the most active and interesting cities to maybe go there and speak on local conference or local meetup. Is it even possible? I mean, for European developers, for example.
Well, for China itself has its own ecosystem, and there are quite a lot of conferences coming out of China. I know there's like CSS conference China, and there's a Vue community is very big in China.
Well, that's obvious.
Yeah, but down towards Southeast Asia, I would say the Singapore tech community is very active. I think it's probably because the country's so small and everybody knows each other. And JSConf Asia has been held in Singapore for the past 3 or 4 years, and that's one of the biggest front-end conferences that we have out of Southeast Asia. There's the first web development conference ever out of Southeast Asia was started in the Philippines by a group. They're not my friends, and they did this conference called Form Function Class, and they had been running it for 10 years. I think they're on a hiatus because conference you definitely understand how hard it is to organize a conference. And then the newest conference, I would say for front end, would be WebConf Asia out of Hong Kong, and India probably has its own series of conferences as well. But I think it's because Asia is fairly similar to Europe in terms of how fragmented it is. Unfortunately, we don't have the ease of travel like the EU.
Yeah.
So there's still kind of a barrier. But in general, I think in terms of number of conferences, there still aren't that many. If we compare Asia to Europe or to America, we don't have that many conferences. But I think that would slowly and gradually change as more and more conferences are starting up, and we are also starting to see speakers in European conferences and in American conferences that are from our region. I think slowly we can start to sell people on the idea that conferences are, you can learn a lot from conferences. You meet a lot of people you otherwise wouldn't have, and it's sort of, I think it takes time to build up a conference, a meetup culture.
But how many of them are English speaking? Is it a thing? Like, is it possible to go to a typical big city conference and know that people would understand what you're trying to say in English, or it's still a problem?
I think India has quite a number, because English is quite common in India.
Historically, yeah.
Yeah, Singapore, every conference is in English. The WebConf Asia in Hong Kong, that's also in English. I think there are actually more English-speaking meetups and conferences than local language ones. It could be because we end up doing a lot of development work in English to begin with.
Right.
So
It helps. Yeah.
So I think there should be no issue if an English speaker would like to give a talk anywhere in Asia. I don't think it's that much of a problem.
Okay. I think I applied to CSS-Conf Asia last year. Didn't get any attention from the program committee, but I'll try to do this again and maybe apply to some other conference, because I'll be glad to open this region. I've never been to Asia, so it would be a good start, I think, to start with the conference.
Yeah, definitely.
So you're giving this typography talk for long now. And what's the next topic you want to explore? Or maybe in articles, maybe your personal interest that wouldn't be converted to talks or articles?
Right now, I'm pretty interested in the whole layout part of things, and I want to see how it is possible to make layouts even more dynamic. I have a few use cases in mind, like as I chat to fellow developers, they're like, oh, this is a problem that I had and I'm using JavaScript to fix it. I'm like, wait, maybe. So it's sort of like when the data is being dynamically loaded and she has to calculate because the content, she doesn't know the content beforehand. And she wants, I think she wants it to all fit on a line, but you can't have a fixed width if you don't know how much space.
Okay.
So I was saying that, Grid introduces these values that are content-based sizing with min content and max content. Maybe that could be something that could solve that problem. So I probably want to explore that bit a bit further. And I want to see how to be able to combine some of these new, like custom, can we use CSS custom properties? How would we use these for more dynamic? To make the layout more dynamic, to make the whole theme of the site more dynamic, which is quite a common use case. I think I've read a few articles by somebody who is looking into this, like how to use custom properties as sort of variables in the grid layout. I think that should be a pretty good use case to sort of sell people on grid. And also I think to raise awareness of how we should code fallbacks, because the most common opposition that we hear is that, I can't use this and I have to support the old browser. But that's a mindset that I think
and they don't even test an old browser. It's just a mindset.
Legitimately, there are people who have to support the older browsers. That's fine. But a lot of people are using it as an excuse. So, So hopefully, I think that the only way to sort of attempt to sway their mindsets is to actually show them. So to be able to build up more and more demos and more use cases to sort of show people that it's not a one-off, a unique thing that, it should be the standard to have like that, and your designs don't have to look exactly the same in every browser. I think this is like my end goal, to get people to accept that if you design for the web, then your design is dynamic.
And you have no other choice, to be honest. Like in every browser, even in Chrome on different operating systems, it looks different. You don't have a chance for your design to look the same in every browser. So don't fool yourself that it's possible. And speaking of your grid and custom properties, like they complicate it on their own, but you want to combine them together. It's gonna be crazy.
Yeah. So hopefully, I think these newer CSS properties, like grid, like custom properties, they are powerful, and people normally just think that it's very complicated. And I agree that it can be complicated, but it doesn't have to. You don't have to use all of it.
Yeah.
Because it's so powerful and so flexible, you can use a small tiny subset of it to achieve a lot. So you can make it as simple as you need it to be or as elaborate as you want it to be. So again, I think it's a mindset thing. Somehow I feel that a lot of us have this all or nothing mindset. Like if I need to use it, I need to use all of it, or else I use none of it. But actually, you can, kind of be in betweenish, and hopefully people will come around to that.
I recently rewrote my presentation engine called Shower from Sass to custom CSS properties.
Oh, nice.
And the first reason was that I was thinking about just trying this. Let's see how it goes when I try to replace dollar things with dash things, and without any further ideas. But then I started it, and I realized that it gives me much more flexibility, and I actually ended up adding more features in my presentation engine because they allowed so much more. And for example, if I need to change a slide ratio now, I just change variable at the header of my presentation. Before, I used to have two versions of a file compiled, one for 4:3 and then 16:9. Today, I have just a single file with a lot of custom properties and just a single key at the top of my presentation. So yeah, before you start trying it in your real everyday projects, it looks like, yeah, it's the same as Sass or less variables. But once you're there, you realize it gives you so much more. So I would love to see your experiments on grid and custom properties. Like it sounds amazing. So looking forward. And thank you for being with us today and visiting Minsk. It's one of my favorite cities in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed your rainy day.
Yeah, but I only wish that I could have spent more time here in Minsk. But maybe I'll come back for holiday next time.
Yep. See you then.
Yep. Thank you.
And welcome another guest of our podcast. It's Migas. Today we're at CSS-Minsk-JS conference, and you gave your talk yesterday about perceived performance, or maybe perceived load performance. How did you get there, and how many times did you give this talk, and how this thing even started for you? I mean, this as you said before, it's quite a long story. You gave this talk more even 10 times. So tell me, where did this talk come from, and what's your experience delivering it in different countries for different audience?
There are so many questions in this one question.
Yeah.
So this talk started as a follow-up to my previous talk, which was about animation performance, and I decided to a bit expand on this topic because there was more to performance I was interested in than just animations. The talk was given for the first time at Krakow JS conference, which is a conference my friends are organizing. And I think it turned out pretty good. So I decided to just apply to some more conferences. And at the same moment, a lot of conferences reached out to me they requested me to give the same talk. So I ended up giving the same talk for around 10 times, as you said. I still meet a lot of people who give me amazing feedback about this talk, but I must say that doing this for so many times gets a bit tiring because I know the content so well that that I have this feeling that how can anyone find this interesting? Like, this is so obvious, but it's just me because I've listened to myself for so many times. That gives me this feeling.
But some people say if your talk, video of your talk is published, you don't have a right to deliver it once again because like everyone saw it already. So what's the point? What do you think about it?
With this talk, actually, I only 2 days ago the video was published publicly of me speaking, but it was actually the shorter version of this talk. So I feel that I still have rights to deliver the talk, maybe, according to these people. But there are many people who go to conferences, and apart from that, they don't really watch all the videos online. And even if they were, there's so much content online that there are always going to be people who never saw your talk, and they will find something interesting in that.
Speaking of videos, right there in my backpack, I have a drive with Peter CSS-Conf videos. That's almost ready, and I think we'll start publishing soon. So you'll have another copy of your video of your talk on Peter CSS-Conf this year. So it's going to be the second one. So I guess you'll have a chance to compare.
Oh yeah, thank you. This is really exciting because this was a bit different version of the talk. I always try to change some things a bit, and also, is this going to be also with the Q&A that we had after?
Yeah, there is a Q&A after that.
This is exciting because I remember Vitaly was asking really good questions for each talk. I don't remember really my questions, and I don't remember my answers because there was some adrenaline rush. But I remember that I was really impressed with how good MC he was.
Yeah, he's just natural. We decided to first of all to invite native speaker, so she would feel comfortable speaking English, not thinking about how good it sounds and how natural it is. But yeah, Vitaly was the perfect choice because he also speaks Russian. And it's easier for us to communicate with him, but he's like natural on a stage.
Yeah, obviously.
Okay, so you made it clear in your talk that perceived performance is more than just loading. It's the whole experience of using a website. But where did this idea of a talk came from? Do you see specific problems or specific mistakes developers do in their interfaces every day, or it was just your personal experience?
First time when I started thinking about performance was after I saw the talk by Paul Lewis. He was working on the I believe he was doing some work as a dev role for performance in Google, and he had a talk on flip technique, which was like really clever trick.
Oh yeah, I remember this.
Yeah, and I thought like this is so clever and so simple and easy to actually introduce in your project. So probably there are gonna be all articles everywhere on the web about it. But when I came back to Poland, it turned out that there wasn't. So I decided to write my own, and during this process, I had so many examples that I decided to actually extract the library out of these examples. So that's how I started actually having my own open source library. And of course, I wanted it to be performant. So I started reading a lot. And when you go through all these resources, a lot of them are actually on a Google developers page. Then you find out how easy some things are to just introduce into your workflow, like just don't animate height of the element and things like that. And this is not something that you learn when you first start your journey with HTML. So I started finding more and more things like that, and I decided to do a summary and just deliver it as a talk.
I think I remember publishing news on Web-standards about your library, Animate CSS, right? Or what's the name?
It was everywhere at one point.
Okay.
It was on CSS Tricks. It was on design newsletters. It was on so many places. To be fair, I don't expand this library because after some point when I understood how it should work, I felt that it's more of a collection of examples than a library that someone should pull to their project. So I kind of a bit abandoned it, but I still feel that it's like for some people it's a good to see how we can easily do animations that are performant actually.
Okay, and why animations? Why these kind of interactions interface? Do you have some personal interest in animations, like some from some designer perspective, or it's just you had some tasks on your job and you decided to implement it this way?
So it started because of this flip technique, because it was all about starting.
It was the very beginning.
Yeah, at the very beginning. Then I had the second library I wrote is it's like a rating widget that has some small animations on top of it. So I was looking for something because I was helping interns in our company to make some rating app. It was like super simple and the designs were really simple, and I wanted just to have something really small that would be a nice design touch, and I couldn't find any nice rating widget that wouldn't have tons of JavaScript. So I decided to write my own, and this small animation was actually this cherry on the top there. And the third library I wrote, it was when I was thinking how you could actually animate gradients performantly. So yeah, they are all around the animations, but usually I don't do animations in my daily work. This is funny. I try to, if I don't have a good reason to put animation in the app, I just don't do it because, performance.
It's funny because this star rating, it was one of the first thing I did back in 2006, 2005 on my blog when blogs were still a thing. And I also made CSS only star rating animations based on links and multiple backgrounds or like weird tricks like that.
Oh,
wow, so many years ago. And people still try to invent the same things, and it becomes easier these days, I guess, compared to like 10 years ago.
Well, I don't think I used many things that weren't there 10 years ago. Okay, animations weren't there, like keyframes. It is something, but I used simple checkboxes and some weirdly hacky selectors to actually style that.
But do you think that CSS only solutions is a valid way of implementing such widgets or interface elements?
If it's possible and if it's not over complicating things, I think it's a perfectly valid thing to do, because sometimes you would have a project where you only need a small thing that is complicated, and then it might spare you pulling in some JavaScript library if you can do it with CSS only. Of course, CSS is not good for everything, but there are so many things you can do with that, and people are just trying to override the natural behaviors with JavaScript and then actually fail to provide like some basic functionality, say accessibility, because they would prefer to use a collection of divs instead of select fields.
But sometimes when you're trying to get a state management in your CSS, which is not possible, so you use form elements, but semantically and they just doesn't make sense.
It's true.
And that's why sometimes form elements are just wrong solution. It's better to write a couple of lines of JavaScript. You don't have to import React to do that. And
it's true.
Yeah, so sometimes a couple of lines of JavaScript is more than enough. And I personally admire projects like you don't need JavaScript. You might not need JavaScript, and some other similar projects when they're trying to do tricky things. But I don't think that all of them are real life solutions.
Oh no,
sometimes they're just games for your own curiosity. Going back to your home country, what can you say about the front-end community in Poland? Like the major cities where activity goes on and the major communities, conferences.
Of course, Warsaw is probably the place to be when it comes to conferences. The Front Trans conference is happening there. I think it's one of the best conferences in Europe, actually, when it comes to front-end.
I attended it 4 times. And on the last time, on the last one, I gave a talk in English, my first one. So that's a special conference for me. So I really enjoyed Warsaw for many times.
Yeah, it is amazing conference. In Krakow, we have some conferences, but they are not as let's say big and good as Front Trends. There was this small Krakow JS conference that It was run last year. Maybe it will happen this year again. So Krakow is also a very robust city when it comes to development. Also Wrocław. I believe there is some activity going on in Poznań. I don't really have much connections there, so I can't say how big it is. But if someone was looking for moving to Poland, I would recommend Warsaw or Krakow. And of course, there is seaside with Gdańsk, where you can also try to find some nice places to work.
But as for meetups and local communities, do you know any apart from this Krakow JS, or because here in Minsk they have like 4 JavaScript meetups. In St. Petersburg we have 3 that are based on local communities. Like in Moscow they have like 3 or 4, maybe even 5. Do you have such variety, or you have some local communities that do like really small meetups or no meetups at all?
So I live in Krakow, so I'll speak about Krakow. We have Mint.js, which is a JavaScript meetup that happens almost every month, but apart from holidays, which is really good. We also have like some smaller ones that happen and are usually sponsored by some companies. I don't really remember the names of them, but if someone started searching, they would find it. There are also some communities that are mostly focused on women and are quite active. One of them is Gig Girls Carrots. They have meetups also every month. I also, with my friends, we also have a Web Muses organization, but we haven't been very active in the past few years because all of us had a big changes in our lives. But when we started, there was nothing like that, nothing targeted at women, and now there's plenty of things like that. We have also pretty nice website which is called Crossweb, and there you can find info on every meetup in every Polish city, and it's like very useful if someone feels like doing something in the evening. There will be always a week with some meetup in Krakow.
No, that's good to know. Frontend is an English-speaking conference, but in general, how good Polish community at speaking English, and is it ready for international conferences? Ready for speakers that comes from different parts of the world?
In Poland, we put a lot of effort into teaching kids English, at least from when I was a kid. And almost every young person will speak good English. And people are not afraid to speak English. And especially in development community, I don't know many developers who would struggle speaking English. Like we are. I don't want to be, not modest, but people are very, very well versed with English.
No, I hear your English. It's great. So I completely trust you.
Thank you.
But here in Russia, Belarus, even Ukraine, having a English-speaking meetup, it's a big thing. It's like it's even a weird thing. Why would you speak foreign language on your local meetup? And this makes sense on one hand because you'll be better integrated to international community. You'll be prepared to give a talk on international conference. On the other hand, you'll have to. It's harder to express yourself in a foreign language. So what do you think? Does it make sense to run local meetups in English, or you should better use your own language?
I think it depends. A lot of meetups in Krakow, I think, have English-speaking talks, and it's not only because it makes sense from the perspective that a lot of words we use on a daily basis at work are English, and then there is just this spaghetti language that we have, like Polish English. But also there is a lot of people who don't speak Polish and live in Krakow and are in developer community who would attend meetups. So it's also for them. Maybe it's. I have a feeling that this not having meetups in English in Russia, for example, might be because you have quite strict visa policy, and it's harder to get to Russia.
That's true.
So maybe you don't have that many people flowing through your cities from outside who would come and listen.
Well, that's why we started to organize Peter CSS Conf.
Yeah, thank you for that. I had a chance to visit your beautiful city thanks to that.
Yeah, and this CSS-Minsk-JS conference doing exactly the same. So they started like half a year later after us to organize first Belarus first English speaking conference in Belarus. Again to gather international community and to have opportunity to speak English, because on local meetups people would look weird at you because it's still not a common thing to do. So
I had a feeling when I was in St. Petersburg that actually people are just not having many chances to train their English skills, and therefore they're quite afraid to speak because they're afraid to fail, like as if it was a matter of honor, like that if they make a mistake, this will be like some kind of dishonor to them. But at the after party, when they had a beer or two, it was way easier to speak English.
Yeah, that's
which
true.
was really funny. So I think it's not their lack of English skills; it's just they're being afraid of doing that. So I would, I think that organizing conferences in English is actually a proxy for them to start learning and using these skills.
Maybe English-speaking Beard.js is a good idea.
Oh, maybe.
They have English and beer at the same time, so it would be easier for them. Well, maybe. I guess I already organized too many meetups in St. Petersburg. We're starting another class, Peter CSS class on September 29th, like for very beginners, offline master classes, so something like this, workshop rather. And maybe it would be good to organize some English-speaking event once, like twice a year, maybe. Just for developers to practice their English.
Yeah. How do you find time for all these things?
I'm asking this question myself. So I guess you're taking a break from giving this talk, and once you get back to your speaking, what would be the next topic you would cover? Just if you have any ideas yet, or areas you'd like to explore.
So I had some thoughts. I'm not sure if I'm going to be doing much of the speaking in the future. It's not something I'm like sure about. But if so, I was thinking about giving a talk on the gaps in between the front-end development and back-end development that should be covered. Like for example, there is accessibility and there is performance, and there's like sometimes just writing content for the alt for images, and these are like these gray areas that sometimes no one wants to pick up as a task, and we are not always aware how to start doing that. So I was thinking about maybe this could be a good topic, but I didn't verify how much would I be able to find on that.
But it sounds interesting because I haven't seen any similar talks, and we're always talking about bringing front end and design closer together, understanding each other, but we're forgetting about backend. Maybe because these days backend and front end line is blurred because of Node.js and JavaScript is a universal language for both front end and backend, but still we have those tasks you mentioned that are not clear enough whose responsibility is and how to solve them properly. So that might be interesting.
Thank you. We'll see.
Looking forward to it. I guess you can never be done with speaking. I think you always, as a developer, I think we have something in us that we want to share what we've learned. So it's just a natural feeling. I wanna give at least a small 10-minute lightning talk on a meetup, but it would fulfill my
fulfill your needs.
Yeah. Because it's a need, like to share information. I think that's why our community is at state that it is, because like we're not just like backend developers sticking to their own code. We're sharing open source and meetups and conferences. It is something different from other part of IT.
Well, I believe that backend developers are also not all like keeping their secrets to themselves. They just probably have different idea on how to share their insights, and their conferences look a bit differently. But there are like tons of Java conferences around, so I believe they also have some need of sharing. Maybe it's just expressed in a bit different way.
Okay, but if you can be the middleman in this situation and bring our worlds together, that would be nice.
Sure, we'll see about that.
Okay, thank you for being with us today, and good luck with your next talk if you ever come back to us with some new ideas.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
You are listening to 139th special episode of Web Standard Podcast. I'm your host Vadim Makeev, and I hope you enjoyed this little experiment. Next week we'll be back with regular Russian-speaking news podcast, but let us know if you'd like to hear something like this in the future. But for now, bye and see you next week. Cheers!